from country to community, how ecological footprint and capacity, biocapacity data is being applied across Canada. This session is being hosted by the Canadian Association for the Global Brome, or CACOR, and the International Ecological Footprint Learning Lab at York University, affectionately known as EIFL. I'll tell you more about CACOR later, but the International Ecological Footprint Learning Lab is an international multi-stakeholder partnership bringing together academics and practitioners to quantify and track global and regional sustainability through the use of ecological footprint and biocapacity metrics. So through EIFL, students and researchers produce the National Ecological Footprint and Biocapacity Accounts, or NEFBA, I guess, a large data set containing ecological footprint and biocapacity data for every country in the world on a timeline from 1961 to 2024. Wow, that's older than I am. All right. So we're going to begin with 4 presentations focusing on different aspects of the work being done at EIFL, and I'd like to introduce you to the presenters now. Eric Miller is the director of the Ecological Footprint Initiative, a data analytics hub at York University. He is also co-director for the International Ecological Footprint Learning Lab, of which EFI is the core partner organization. Then Fiona Low is the senior data analyst for the FE, and she completed her master's in environmental studies at York University in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Andrew Reeves has been the postdoctoral fellow in ecological macroeconomics and metrics in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University since June 2024. A mathematical physicist by training, he worked as a programmer prior to his PhD in astrophysics at the University of Waterloo. He now works with data sets relating to ecology and economics, as well as system dynamics, macroeconomic, and system dynamics, macroeconomic economics and modeling. All right. Finally, Perry Dworchak is a partnership coordinator for the EIFL partnership and a PhD student at York University in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. We're going to begin with Eric Miller. Over to you, sir.
Great. Thank you for this opportunity to present a portfolio of our work that we believe will be of interest to members of the Canadian Association for the Global Brome, and we think beyond that in Canada and even around the world as well. And thank you for creating and pursuing the Canadian Association for the Global Brome with its mission to encourage and enable Canadians to explore, understand, and advocate for the sustainability of the biosphere. This mission certainly aligns well with our mission to inform the world about ecological footprint and biocapacity, to benefit research and development in its metric and measurement system, and also to help others apply it. So we draw inspiration from the work of the Brome, and especially from a scripture chart that it came called the Ecological back in 1972, which was from before the time that all of our speakers were born, but nevertheless, its work has endured and has been continued on to many other publications since then, including Beyond the Limit. In the 1990s, published then, and we go through that after that, and so the growth up to about 10 and roughly in 2004. And then including, for example, more recently, looking up through the year 2052, as it was looked at for the next 40 years. And so this time span is very relevant to our work because we have been assembling statistics from around the world to enable us to understand the pathway of ecological footprint and biocapacity over this timeline, even citing before the publication of the unit for growth. And so we have, as we'll see in our presentation, we'll be able to see some of this data at a country level, at a community level, and also even at a global level. And so from 1972, when the list of growth was published, until the most recent year of data available, which was 2024, this, I believe, in mind with the thought of commanding ecological footprint and planetary capacity. Now, the work that limits the growth and all of the work that's been inspired since then has focused a lot on system dynamics, the interplay between components of systems, positive and negative feedback mechanisms at work, and so on. And you'll see some of the dynamism in the shape of this plot climate. And certainly also how this is the relationship between humanity and the biosphere, which is represented in this way by the ratio of ecological suffering, which is humanity's domain, or the regenerative capacity of the planet, divided by the regenerative capacity of the planet, which we call biocapacity. Now, since then, here's the red line of the planet's biocapacity. And so since that timeline, over that timeline since 1942, the world has been what we call ecological footprint overshoot with respect to capacity. And this phrase overshoot appears in the links to growth back in the early 1970s, with obvious concern about it, understanding the interplay between human activity and the biosphere and the consequences of overshoot. And so it's within this realm that we'll share some statistics about ecological footprint and biocapacity in more detail, right? So pass it over to not just figure out the details. Let's go to this.
Thank you, Eric. So what Eric just showed us was humanity's total ecological footprint. And you might be wondering what it is actually made up of. And there's actually two ways that we can break it down. First is by the 6 ecological footprint components, that are known as the land types. And as you can see on the legend, from forest carbon uptake to fish and grass. And on this slide, you can see on this new graph, you can see exactly the same as what Eric shown in the last slide, but starting from 1961, the world or the humanity's total ecological footprint relative to the biocapacity. So from here, you can see that the majority of the world's total footprint comes from the forest carbon uptake component, which means the forest area that is needed to sequester our carbon emissions. And it's also the one that has been increasing the most among all the components. Besides looking at the footprint, humanity's footprint by its components, we can also break it down to simply the sum of all countries, which is exactly what we do in our national ecological footprint and biocapacity accounts, as Andrew had mentioned from the beginning. So these accounts, in this account, we produce the ecological footprint and biocapacity at the national level for 244 countries that currently exist or have existed from 1961 to the most recent year. And we publish the update for these accounts every year. And the account is produced by analysts from York University and starting from the 2025 edition with analysts from the University of Iceland as well. One of the analysts, Neha, is also with us today in the audience. For us to produce these accounts, we get production, trade data, and emission data from reputable and official sources. A lot of our data comes from the United Nations, particularly the Food and Agriculture Organization. And the data that we get on micro level data, they're collected as the species and commodity level. So this table in the middle, it shows all the details that we have, all the micro level data that we have in our account. And we turn these detailed data into the footprints for each country at the national level. So for each country, we essentially produce different types of footprints, which means that we calculate the footprints not only embedded in production, but also footprints embedded in the import and the export. And this allows us to calculate the footprint embedded in the consumption for each country. In this process, we essentially turn data on the hectare of land and into global hectare, which is the unit that we use for ecological footprint and biocapacity, where 1 global hectare is equal to 1 hectare of land with the world's average productivity. And we also turn it into global hectares per capita to measure or compare the average footprint per person in each country. So now let's take a look more closely on Canada's footprint. So on the slide here, we see a graph comparing Canada's footprint of consumption to its biocapacity. And unlike the one that we've shown for the world, you can see that our consumption, footprint of consumption, which is represented by the orange line, is smaller than Canada's biocapacity. And it means that at the national level, Canada is not in overshoot. But it is also very important to note that Canada's footprint of consumption has been increasing, and we hit a record high recently in the year 2022. Another maybe more meaningful comparison to look at consumption at a country or national level would be to compare the ecological footprint per capita with the world's average, which Tara's going to talk about later in her part. Besides looking at Canada's footprint at the timeline, like the overall level, we can also zoom in into specific years. So now let's zoom in into the year of 2022, where we hit that record high. So in this bar chart, from left to right, starting from the first bar on the left, we have Canada's area and then in biocapacity in the second bar chart. And you can see here that the Canada's biocapacity is smaller than its area. This is because only our cropland is more productive than the world's average, whereas our forest land, fishing ground, and grassland are all less productive than the world's average. So that resulted in a biocapacity that is smaller than our area. Now, moving from the third bar onwards, we can see the footprint of production, import and export, and the consumption. And from here, we can see that Canada is a net exporter of our ecological footprint because our footprint export is larger than our footprint of import. In other words, we export more footprint-intensive goods compared to import. And because of this, we have a footprint of consumption that is smaller than our production. And if we were to kind of look into the size of each component or try to interpret what it means, we see that Canada exports a large portion of the footprint-intensive forest products and crops when we look at the bar with footprint of export. So here is a very quick summary of Canada's footprint in 2022 or the whole timeline at the national level. And now I'll pass it to Andrew to talk about footprint at the subnational level.
Thanks, Fiona. So yeah, subnational level, let's look at Ontario, Canada's most populous province, where I'm currently situated. So we have produced subnational accounts using additional data relating to the relative production in Ontario of various goods compared to the national level for Canada. So we can downscale to the provincial level for more nuanced provincial level results. So these results will be part of a report submitted to the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And so I've got 3 bar graph here. On the left, we can see biocapacity for Ontario with an additional component added that we were exploring, which is using including wetlands in our account because they can function as a carbon uptake, carbon sink. And so we can see that in these 2 plots on the right, the ecological footprint of production in Ontario and the footprint of consumption, we see this opposite pattern to the relative to the national. We can see that ecological footprint of consumption is higher in Ontario than the ecological footprint produced. Next slide, please. So let's look at per capita. This is per person in a given year. So you got these nice time series here. Looking at the top plot, you can see that Ontario in the green line, the ecological footprint of domestic consumption is just slightly lower than the Canadian average, which of course is much larger than the world average. But then looking in the bottom plot, ecological footprint of production, we can see that the overall footprint of production for Ontario is significantly lower than the rest of Canada. And this is consistent over time. So moving to the next way of looking at this data. We can look at the exported minus imported of footprint, and this can just another way of looking at this data and making it clear in our minds. So this is the total footprint again. And so we can see that the amount of embedded footprint exported is higher for components of cropland, grazing, and forest in Ontario. This is the total. But for carbon footprint and fishing grounds, we can see that we are exporting a negative amount. So we're importing a ton of embodied carbon from our consumption here in Ontario. And I'll briefly mention a tool that we produce. So we produce a number of tools that can be used at lower levels, for example, community or industry or government levels. Using these national, so I mentioned these national footprint accounts for Canada, and then these relative production commodity tables from Statistics Canada that look at national and provincial level. We use that to scale down to the produced footprint, imported footprint, exported footprint, consumed footprint for Ontario. And using supply and use tables, these big fancy industry tables, production tables from Statistics Canada, we can produce extended input-output tables, which are commonly used ecological economics tool. With these extended input-output tables, we can see how production itself for different types of expenditures and industries. Sorry, let's just go back for 1 sec. You can see how they relate to, for example, consumption, government expenditure, or investment in the gross fixed capital formation. And so with these relations, it forms a really nice tool. And we can express this, for example, in global hectare average units per dollar of expenditure and produce these big useful tables for calculators. So on the next slide, I've got this big scary table. Don't worry about the details, but basically you can see this very detailed breakdown of different expenditure types. This is the footprint per dollar of consumption. So you can take some basket of consumption, for example, at the household level or community level, or a company level. They can take their basket of consumption or investment or whatever they're doing and multiply it by this fancy table, and then they get the amount of crop footprint component, grazing footprint component, and so on for that. And so this hopefully provides a nice segue for Perry, who will talk about community level applications and calculators.
Thank you, Andrew. So just as Andrew said, we calculated ecological footprint and biocapacity at the Ontario provincial level, but we've gone even further to calculate ecological footprint and biocapacity at the city level in Ontario. So we've done this for over 500 cities and rural areas in Ontario, coming to the number of 577 what we call census subdivisions, or what Statistics Canada calls census subdivisions. And so what I have on the screen right here is a screenshot of our data being presented on a publicly accessible digital data dashboard that's hosted by the Rural Ontario Institute, who is our partner in this project to generate this data. And so right now you can see we're on the main environment homepage, and you can see ecological footprint being represented as global hectares per capita is the environment indicator that's selected in the bottom left. And so it's displaying all of the communities, starting from the highest global hectares per capita, going all the way to the lowest, which you can't see because that would be cut off. And so this is one way to look at the digital data dashboard, but we can also zoom into specific communities. So if we go to the ecological footprint tab, this is showing the city of Toronto ecological footprint and biocapacity, split up into the same components that we've seen before, including the addition of the wetlands component for biocapacity. It's not so prominent in the city of Toronto, where 94% of biocapacity is built with land, but for rural communities and Northern Ontario community wetlands, it's the component. And so an interesting thing about looking at the data this way and how we presented it is that we also break it down by household subcategories of consumption. So splitting it up into personal transportation, services, food, housing, and goods, we can see the proportion that people consume within those categories. And we have the ability to compare that between cities and rural areas because they're not always the same. So for Toronto, the highest proportion is personal transportation and the lowest is goods, but that's not always the case for every community. And so on the digital goods dashboard, we can also compare, so right now we're only looking at Toronto, but we can also compare different cities and rural areas. Sorry, going back one slide there. Over on the left-hand side under region and community types, you can click different communities and make different comparisons. And you can also click on different regions. So for instance, you can click the city of Vaughan, but you can also look at York region, which amalgamates several cities together. And so in addition to generating the data and producing a digital data dashboard, we've also written a report, but we've also written a paper that's soon to be published in the Journal of Climate Change, Policy and Economy. And so this graph on the next slide, that's going to be published in that paper, compares the 10 most populous cities in Ontario to the Ontario average, the Canadian average, and the world average ecological footprint. So you can see ecological footprint of consumption, so global hectares of consumption on a per capita basis, with Markham at the lowest at 5.3 global hectares per capita, up to Brampton at 7 global hectares per capita. All of these cities are below the national average at 7.35 global hectares per capita. And then there's a range compared to the Ontario average, which makes sense. And important to note that all of these cities, the 10 most populous cities in Ontario, the Ontario average and the Canadian average, are all far ahead of the world average at 2.57 global hectares per capita. So we've shared this data at the city level and at the Ontario level. So we've been able to scale ecological footprint and biocapacity to what we would call geographical boundaries. But we can also calculate ecological footprint for communities that don't necessarily share a geographical boundary. So for instance, if this community shares a common set of values or interests, just like the Canadian Club of Rome, for instance, you all are within Canada, presumably, but you don't represent the full population. So using what we call ecological footprint calculators, we are able to, sorry, this next slide. So we're using ecological footprint calculators. We are able to calculate ecological footprint for a community without using a geographical region. And so this example that I have on the screen was an ecological footprint calculator created for the Métis Nation of Ontario. It's a web-based calculator with a beautiful design done by a Métis Nation web developer. And so if we go to an example of a question that's used in the calculator, this question asks, how much money per week on average is spent on different kinds of food? So it breaks it up into breads and cereals as the first part, animal meat as the second, fish and seafood as the third, and then dairy and other animal byproducts, including eggs. So you can see the level of detail that we can get to in these questions. And particularly when we make these calculators for specific communities, like the Métis Nation of Ontario, or we've made a calculator for a group of Toronto parishes, we are able to design the calculator with specific questions and more accurate data so that we can produce more reliable results and results that represent the community better. So questions that represent their activities and consumption better. And so we've shared all of these examples of different ways of scaling ecological footprint and biocapacity to different levels. But we can also apply this data in analysis and policy analysis. So I'll turn it over to Eric to talk about that.
Great. So we thought that it might be of interest in the Canadian Association for the Program to explore one of the specific interplays between human activities and here. And that is certainly something of interest going back to the first the growth through the testimony was interesting on that. So a demographic variables obviously affect people on the footprint. But it's, I think, important to reflect on some of these details because there are many demographic variables and they all play sort of complementary roles to affecting ecological footprint, whether that's measured on a consumption basis within the jurisdiction, or whether that's reflecting trade flows, easy plan, which actually means like import and exports, as well as production, what we go out for corporate consumption members in Canada, and obviously that is going to in part a function of the total population. And so in Canada, there's certainly the total population has increased substantially over time, and especially in the last few years in Canada. There's a thought in 1961 to 1924 to increase land as we calculate capacity. And I've got this dotted black line there showing you the trend over time. You can see that there are periods in history when the changing to the population has been higher or lower than this trend is otherwise been, with the exception of the last 2 years, which was a substantial increase in the population now. It's not just the total population that is the population. The age distribution of the population also has an effect too. Now, the age distribution of the Canadian population is like most national population distribution, which is not uniform of the individual population. There are gauges in that pattern, and that reflects the breathing buck along the front and so with the difference in the distribution of the population, it's also having an effect on consumption and ecological footprint because consumption only provides the footprint very dependent on the degree of life, because obviously different examples of things and so just for examples relating to this in my mind, for example, this is the medical services of a function of the Canadian population, and so we can appreciate that the demand for medical services very much on the basis of food. And so, of course, there are many examples to draw on where we see these relationships. We often see these relationships as well manifested not only in terms of food, but also in terms of geography. So here's an example of the participation rate in the hunting and fishing outdoors card in Ontario. As the state just the fishing outdoors card in Ontario, and the in Ontario, you're familiar that the purpose of the fishing outdoors card was fishing hunting outdoors card that many grants use to license to participate in that activity. And so with the statistics about the usage of the people that have this card, you can see there is a distinct need pattern to that, but there's also a geographic trend as well. The those in the East are the higher potential to have these cards in the last now, not only the age distribution of population, but there can often be cohort differences, which can be very important. So that's the distinction between different generations of people, even when they reach the same age as other people. And so, as one example of there's been a change over time in the age distribution of the ownership rate of housing. Rising drops, that's a very big topic in the news as well. Reading public policy about that, and so we see shifts. You look at it in a cohort, and so that's where things are also considered. And then, of course, the propensity to live with others in the household have a very significant effect on the ecological footprint. This is a plot of the average number of people per household in Canada. Is present, and you can see that the average number of people per household in Canada is much smaller in LA than the Now, of course, we still have houses that were built in the 1880s with us today. Presenting from one that was built in the early 1900s. And so that building stock is still with us, but the occupation of that building stock is different because that household is smaller. And so that also relates to some questions about the living space to be shared within a household, and all sorts of other policy aspects related to that, such as how you make it so it's much easier to share living spaces with others, especially as people are, let's say, family teams, where perhaps people within the family move out, and so one is left with the same amount of living space shared with less people. Whether you either share that through renovations or some other mechanism. All this considered is the distribution of population, social differences in potential for living other than the household that all combined do not affect on the average. And so then we can put in simple terms, things that are decomposing to like the footprint into the distinct components of the patterns of the average per capita ecological footprint, and that interaction with the total population, the total population multiplied by the average per capita, and of course generate the total ecological footprint. Now, of course, we shouldn't assume that the demography and the variables are in themselves sort of intelligence kind of on their own. They are, of course, modified by different factors. And so policy can affect demographic variables on students, and we know that it's very obviously, certainly in Canada, there's a lot of growth development, a lot of emphasis on more collection, more consumption, more producing, and more consumer. Because of course the policies around the availability of constraints, so that's a great choice of effectiveness. And of course the availability of constraints on the market basis here, which then allows for provisions to be made to the marketplace rather than relying on those within the household to provide. And of course, there are other economic policies that affect income distribution, which all then affect demographics related to things like migration, so putting all this together, here's the economic footprint of consumption in Canada, represented by the blue bars, over 1961 to 2004. And as you can see with the blue bars, those are like the footprint of consumption in Canada has increased for that time. Even though there's a lot of variability over that time, so any reflecting notable circumstances in Canada, such as in the early 1980s, the 1970s, the significant recession in Canada at that point, in the early 1990s, then let's say the 2008 financial crisis, and then more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 there, and then into 2021. In that orange line, we've got people who on top of this is the trend in the per capita, average per capita ecological footprint of consumption. And you can see the average per capita ecological footprint of consumption, that's kind of young, while the total ecological footprint so this pattern is not unique to Canada. There are many countries that have this pattern, but there are also many countries that have different patterns, including a declining total ecological footprint of consumption, and declining per capita, or even a declining total but an increase in the per capita. And so in this plot, we have arranged all the countries in the world by means of a bubble. The size of the bubble relates to the ecological footprint in relative terms of national consumption in 2024. And the position of that bubble reflects the depletion of how its aggregate ecological hectares have changed over the last 25 years in terms of the x-axis, the orange axis, versus the the y-axis, or the vertical. In blue, it shows the things per capita over hectares for that 25 years range. And so in the upper quadrant here, we have countries that have had a growth in the aggregate ecological footprint and a growth in the per capita, and the same trend arose with growth in the aggregate and a decrease in the per capita number. And that's the really Canada within this quadrant is the growth in the aggregate and the key growth in the average per capita is about 10%. That's compared to overall more countries in the world. And so, bring all this together, we took an interest not only in tracking ecological footprint of consumption historically, but we've also explored scenarios in the future. And so, we've done some work globally on considering the southeast and UN population scenarios, exploring what the world might look like in 2050, based on some assumptions of the trends in capita ecological footprint and also in population as projected by into the future. And so we could think about the context of Canada. We think about the next 5 years in Canada. There are a variety of ways to explore scenarios of what the ecological footprint might be. And so what we've done in this instance, a lot of the data from published Canada with its population scenario, and then we combine those with statistics of ecological footprint on a per capita basis to then show what the tracking is. And so this is a trend line of ecological footprint consumption in Canada projected over the next 25 years based on trend over the last 25 years in terms of the plain average per capita. Multiplied by the total population, that time span of 2025 versus 2050, based on the scenario for and so obviously with the scenario that Canada generated about growth, population growth, scenario, even with their medium growth scenario, you see that would anticipate this due to policy issues and market factors, quite a substantial increase, a continued increase in ecological footprint from people that income and pressure. Of course, it's quite a challenge because Canada is also increasing emissions, emissions that involve reducing gas emissions as much as possible. And whatever gases are still needed in that time period would be no greater than the amount that can be sequestered from the biosphere, and then we can sequester emissions by the biosphere. We can of course do that through the earth and wetlands and land cover and land usage and so on. Those other components are included in the framework of the footprint, and so we really think the framework is very useful to talking about actually with the amount of information we want to have ecological footprint within the amount of biocapacity content. In other words, product and ecological footprint. Now we can also use these scenarios to ask questions of okay, well then what increased reductions do we have to have on that especially that are not increasing footprint. And so in this case, we have it so that we have to high growth demographic narratives of Canada. We would need to decline or reduce the average per capita ecological footprint by 3.6 times as much as has been achieved in the trend line over the last 25 years to get to having that demographic not increasing. So there are lots of possibilities of exploring scenarios in the future. Of course, in light of decades-long work supported by the public realm and also the association. So it's a pleasure to be able to share some of these ideas with you to provide you with inspiration and to potentially to support our research. And so in this regard, going from the national picture to then to the broader picture, we'd like to conclude by speaking about this awesome international ecological footprint.
Thank you, Eric, for that really interesting application of ecological data. And so all of this work, these projects, this research, this data generation that we've just shared with you is made possible through the International Ecological Footprint Learning Lab. We are an international multi-stakeholder project funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We train graduate level students on sustainability informatics to be able to produce the National Ecological Footprint and Biocapacity accounts, and then go on to produce research using ecological footprint and biocapacity data and working with our multi-stakeholder partners to be able to answer questions that are of interest to them. And so here are some of our partners on the screen. They range from academic institutions to nonprofits, public organizations, and even some private entities as well. And so I'll conclude by saying that one of the most important aspects, or one of the most valuable aspects of ecological footprint and biocapacity data is its ability as a communication tool to be able to communicate our impact on the environment through economic activity. And to have its ultimate value as this communication tool is possible when this data and this information is publicly accessible. And so our data is online, it's publicly accessible. These are some links and QR codes to access it. And we also have our email if you have any questions or if you want more detailed data. So I thank you all for coming to this presentation. Thank you to the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome for having us and asking us to present. And I look forward to questions and discussion.
And Fiona and Andrew and Eric, wow. Even as a mathematician in my background, data is not always very exciting, but this reminds me of the talks that we got on TED with Hans Rosling, who would have these fabulous presentations of data and open up a whole new world. I'm going to take prerogative to put out the first question. If anyone else has other questions, they can put them in the chat and we will get to them. We've got another 40 minutes or so of time to ask some questions. I want to roll things right back to the very beginning because, you jump to the part that's kind of exciting for you, and there's some basics that I think for me, I don't know about others, that I was kind of missing. And that was in the very presentation or the calculation of ecological footprint. Right at the beginning, there were these huge growths in the black, and that was listed as forest carbon uptake. So forest harvest, I understand that has a footprint. Grazing lands, I understand how that works. Cropland, built up land. But three of them I was curious about how they become part of an ecological footprint. One is the forest carbon uptake. What does that really mean? Secondly, what is fishing grounds in terms of ecological footprint? And thirdly, wetlands showed up there later as well. And I was wondering how wetlands can be part of an ecological footprint. So if somebody could pick that up and just go with that, that would give me a better grounding from where you're coming from.
Yeah, maybe I can start by addressing the first part, the forest carbon uptake. It might be helpful to also put the slide, but I will just start answering. So forest carbon uptake in terms of footprint, it represents the amount of forest area that is needed to sequester the carbon emissions that we produce. So it's kind of, you have to understand it in a different way compared to cropland or grazing land. It's not the amount of area that we use to produce crops for our consumption, but it's the amount of area that is needed to address or to absorb, to handle all the carbon emissions that we produce.
Okay, so how about fishing grounds and wetlands?
Sure, I think I'll start with fishing grounds. So fishing grounds is the area of marine and inland water that's needed to support consumption of aquatic species. So important to note that we do include marine and inland water. for globally and for Canada. For Ontario, we would be looking at an water, of course. And then wetlands. So wetlands, as we said in the presentation, was added in an innovation added in for Ontario and Ontario cities and rural areas. And this is only added in as a biocapacity component, not as an ecological footprint component. So we thought wetlands were significant in their carbon sequestration, or they are significant in their carbon sequestration, but not as significant in terms of what we consume from them. So that's how fishing grounds and wetlands relate to ecological footprint and biocapacity.
Thank you. That is very helpful. So you're using the forest to kind of do a measurement of the carbon output and see how much forest it would take to bring that carbon back into the biosphere, if you will, or back into the safely into the environment, I guess. So there was a question here from Gabriella. So Gabriella, if you could turn your video on and unmute yourself, and Richard van der Yacht, you will be up next. Gabriella, go ahead with your question.
All right. Can you hear me?
We can.
All right. Sorry. Yes. Hi, this is Gabriella, and I'm a member of CACOR. And I'm extremely impressed by all the by your presentation and the work. It's fascinating how much information we can get from what you have presented today. What I'm questioning is where and how do you get a lot of your information from, let's start with Ontario and then we can go to Canada. But whom do you use to get all that information to do all your calculations? I think it's a bit of a general question. I'm sure you use institutes and Statistics Canada and so on, but it must be more than that.
Who wants to take that one?
I can carry one over.
Maybe I can talk about the Ontario cities, and then if you want to focus on the province of Ontario.
Okay.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so for the Ontario cities work, just like you said, we use Statistics Canada data. We also use Ontario GeoHub data. So the Ontario GeoHub data is geographic spatial data in the form of raster files, whereas from Statistics Canada, we use economic, demographic, as well as some boundary files as well. And then in terms of the data analysis, that's done on our team. And with this specific project, a GIS technician from the Rural Ontario Institute. So in this case, the data sources are really just two, but it changes depending on what scale we're calculating for.
Right.
And to give more of a sense, elaboration on that, when we're generating statistics for all of Ontario, we try as much as possible to get eventually scaled data from Statistics Canada, so that we could ideally also apply it to other provinces at some point if there's other provinces that want to show an interest. I think, you know, if you would help us in that regard, that would be awesome. Because the province of Ontario is interested in this data, and ideally other provinces would be as well. And so as Andrew was speaking about in the presentation, the economic data and some of the input-output tables and data supply and use tables, which Statistics Canada has on a national basis and on a provincial basis. Not how everything's provincial accounts, but there's no municipal version for that. So that's why when Terry was speaking to get municipal level data, then you have the census information that is available down to the census subdivision around the meeting time of people down to that census unit. The things around income, around family size, around living space, how many are in multiple units, single units, and all that sort of stuff. And so all of that gets integrated in into our systems of delivering information. And when we're calculating the results in Ontario, we're also making use of national and international data from our national accounts. And so when we generate these national accounts, we talk about data we work from all those organizations that commented on the earlier slide. When we put all that together, at least on the international level, prior edition, we had really three to come up with really limited data in 47 million, but for this latest edition, actually, we've got another 12 million added to that and so on. So there's a lot of data points that go in. We have processes that we follow to integrate it. Unfortunately, we need to clean it because there's a new gap sometimes along the timeline. Sometimes there are some data points that seem somewhat suspicious. And so that's part of our work as well. Sort of isolating those suspicious data points, trying to make sense of it. And we try to work with statistics that are what we call biophysical, like quantities of things, rather than dollars. I think because the dollar amount spent on something is not necessarily indicative of quantity, but still with dollar information, we're able to then evaluate whether the quantity will turn information from suspect or not. So, yeah, with this awesome team, a number of us are one of us are very experienced in terms of the number of years of developing the process to do this. Also, and it's really the saying at the start that we on a job that we integrate the pedagogy in graduate programs. And we're really proud of that because then we're able to generate awesome data and apply this to additional realms of development.
It's fascinating. There's a lot of information. One of you mentioned something about value as well. And in CACOR, we also have something, a committee that we call value. So we do attach some importance to. I'm wondering how would you measure that? That would be more difficult, right? Or would it be geographic and population?
Just to clarify, maybe you might clarify when you think your
values. Yes. Social values.
Okay.
Yeah.
You remember what context that came up in, Gabriella?
I can't remember. I know someone mentioned it, but we can forget about it because I know you and I were dealing with values, so it was an interesting. It triggered something.
Yeah, but that keyword, it's like hearing your own name. Okay,
Yes.
so let's move to Richard
you.
and then Vlad. And we can actually switch now to just putting a hand up in the Zoom if you have a question. That works for me.
Andrew, can I just respond to the value thing really quickly?
Go ahead.
I think I know why it came up.
Oh, excellent.
When I was thinking about the ecological footprint calculators, so those are designed not for a geographic community, but how I sort of think about it is it's a community that has a shared set of values or interests or some sort of commonality. So CACOR would be a perfect example of that, where you have a shared set of interests and values. And although you are geographically around Canada, you represent the whole population of Canada, of course.
Right.
So we can use ecological footprint calculators to calculate ecological footprint for communities such as that.
Great,
Very
thank you. I remember that part now too. Richard, over to your question, and then Vlad and Evelyn.
Okay, thank you. Just to the speakers in general, I mean, this is very, very important data, obviously, and it has, I think it has the potential for high impact. I was wondering, how are you proposing to use this data to mobilize politicians and change for the better, where we can follow better practices? I mean, yesterday I published an article in Hillside Strong on some good news in the climate change, because there are good practices that are now changing that trajectory that you actually beautifully demonstrated.
that actually is driving emissions down and decreasing the ecological footprint in other countries. So that's what we need to do in Canada, and I'm wondering how you are proposing to do this here in Canada. How are you planning to move forward?
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'll start off with the answer to that. We're looking to partner with people who have experience and ideas of how to do that.
I can help.
Which is amazing, and I really appreciate the comment of the chat as well around Los Angeles climate, etc. Yeah, let's make it happen. I mean, one challenge, I guess, with our initiative is that we spend so much time on the data, the projects and so on that we need to rely upon others to help us make an impression, to put up meetings recently. If you or anyone else is connected with any people on the Hill that are in common with the Senate, they have committees. Sometimes they can call people from the academy and elsewhere to provide information, data, testimony, etc. And I think to do that as well. And for anyone else who maybe is keen on data visualization, storytelling, videography, even the arts and so on, we have a very speaking of the Eric, I put my email in the chat, so you got it. Send me an email and we'll follow up. There we go.
I might also have a
Yeah, go ahead.
more long-ranging, long-term, I guess, a vision, which I believe personally, we have different perspectives on how to go about change, but I believe that ultimately this will require a change in how our political systems function. And I'm kind of the vision that we need to plan our economies collectively and democratically. And so what really excites me about kind of reflecting on this presentation, we have all these national, subnational, and like community levels, and like community can be defined in different ways, geographically and otherwise, is it provides almost like a blueprint for experimenting with how to do this democratically and collectively at all different levels of society. And I'll leave it to your imaginations to fill in how we do that, but I think there's something there that's really exciting.
Yeah. Maybe inverse weighting of your ecological footprint against your vote value. I don't know. Vlad, over to you.
Thank you all for this great presentation. My name is Vlad. I'm based in Toronto. I'm with the Degrowth Research Circle, recently created at York University, and I'm also the editor of the Sufficiency and Wellbeing magazine. So I have a more generic question. So all this data hints at the wide canvas of causal chains, which may all be captured under the umbrella of how the economic system is designed, specifically with its focus on perpetual growth. So if we attempted a contrafactual interpretation of this data, can we find causes for the ecological overshoot that do not originate in the design of the economic system? And I'll leave it open like that. So do not originate in the design of the economic system.
I guess I could continue on my prior thought. Eric talked about demographics, and I kind of just talked about like the need for an economy that's more planned collectively rather than competing and just producing for profit and things. I think there is like a hard fact that each person needs to eat and consume certain things. So those aspects of the ecological footprint are very hard to change. But things like grazing, for example, the amount of meat protein that we consume, that's something that's quite flexible and could be decided in the economic political term. It's just like if we eat less, cattle and so on, that'll massively reduce certain aspects of the crop and grazing footprints. And then there's also like lands to be used for different things. So you could have, multi-use land. That's again like political economic question of monocropping versus not monocropping. Currently, capitalist industrial agriculture prefers monocropping, but we could have agroecology systems that could require a shift in how we do our economic political decision making. And then obviously there's the carbon footprint. That's the biggest component and in some ways sort of the easiest to change because it doesn't require a demographic shift per se. It requires changing how we do business as usual and intentionally deciding to get off of fossil fuels, which currently mainly China is pushing that most aggressively. Is decarbonization. It seems like that's kind of underway there now. But the West is currently lagging behind. They're starting to take a leadership role. So, that can feed into how we deal with what do we need? We need probably some kind of planning and long-term viewing of the future rather than short-term profit-oriented entrenched interests controlling the reins of decision making.
Thank you, Andrew. Madeline, your question. Oh, sorry, Eric. Yeah.
One thought, it might be helpful, that everyone on the call is trying to provide too, but also, my action that we spoke about was, well, it's a pretty big result. And so one of the things that I found interesting a couple of years ago, when we did the Ontario analysis, the first time we had the first assessment 5 years ago, and we now that we probably some something that we did afterwards was went through each of the detailed components of what we call final union of consumption, let's say, so we call them as a whole. And then we were three people with my head and trying to figure out the extent to which they can be affected by decisions made individually as the case versus the decisions to be made on the basis of the household as the case and the decisions that need to be made on the basis of society. And so, like for the example that Andrew was speaking about, there are some things that can be done differently on an individual level, as compared to others that I help with. I drive and I think I have in different ways, which is the here. But then when it comes to things like the living space, the temperature that we heat or cool it at, or we have to use someone is going to put more serious on the house level and a lot of the equipment and finances and that kind of stuff. But then at the society level, it's not our health ourselves that find the electrical grid and use the power. So power here as a side note, but so you can appreciate with the different thinking that I think also the way to help people sort of imagine and understand around the different levels of the things at the level of the economy or the grid or et cetera. It's more provincial in nature, it might be municipal, it might be national in things. That's the same from other things. And when we did that, then we calculated what's the ecological footprint actually within each of those. And really exact percentages, but let's just use the broad brush stroke. More or less, there's almost a third. So you can have like a third related to individual decisions, stuff with others, a third of the level of the household, number a third of the level of so thank you for offering that in case that might be helpful for you compose the big challenge of and yeah, share that now. That was done for the Ontario context. It's one thing that we didn't know, but it's really important for the national regional is that when we haven't done this work, but other people have looked at ecological central subdivisions at different central subdivisions across the country. And so that's where, depending on where the regions have that, you could either have a higher or lower propensity to be higher or lower above the average just based on that geography where you are, in part related to how electricity is. Some parts of this country generate electricity in the grid, almost entirely by wind electricity, where those parts of this country is no carbon electricity. So that's one thing that obviously is also very important too. And so those ratios of the proportions were very distinct from their 15.
Thank you. Actually, there's one thing that stood out to me just before we get back to Madeline. You mentioned medical services, and you were even tracking the medical services. How do those relate to ecological footprint?
Well, sorry, that was on my own tracking, so I was taking other research.
Okay.
By Benson and others that did that. But I had a sort of an example of how demand for things can be function based.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Now, I mean, that would be the next part of our research, understanding what the different profile of consumption based on food choices. So that can help us understand how which parts of Canada and its own, regardless of community, aggregate population, will affect the impact of ecological footprint. But that's still research being done. That we haven't done yet. It's a bit harder to get consumption level data at the level that we need to do. That is possible to do that, but that would be, that's why I didn't have any footprint examples because it hasn't yet been done.
Madeline, you've been very patient. Over to you.
I'm following up a little bit on what Richard said, and because I was looking at what you presented, and I really appreciated all of that, and I appreciated the resources that you mentioned when you first started speaking. And I guess I realized that most of your students are taking courses to learn about gathering data, doing data analysis, and but just like Richard, I'm looking at using what it is, your students come up with and you come up with and bring it to the community. And I was thinking that a lot of the things that you mentioned, like when you're looking at housing, these are all really very important issues today in government. And I know Richard gets a lot of the political people when he does things in the New York Times. But I'm thinking at the community level, and I'm thinking that a lot of what you said about, and I'll just take housing as an example, that would be, it would be interesting if some of your students were able to write stuff for the local paper based on what they come up with when they're doing their work, just to show that what they're doing in the university course also is very practical and very open. And we had someone from social innovation from St. Paul University give a presentation to our women's issues and perspective committee, and she was centered on housing, and some of her students went out and did things. But this information is only known when we speak to people like you. We don't keep getting it, and I also taught at university, and well, you got 60 papers you're doing, and you've got about 20 students who come up with really interesting ideas. How do you get them together and say, hey, you guys really have something special here? Can you do it? And to put the incentive, could it also be part of the evaluation? When you're doing your big thing at the beginning and presenting your courses, you say, now, by the way, there's this possibility too to get, better marks and also use what you're learning. So that was just a comment. So thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. Did that inspire anything, response at all? Or?
Maybe I'll respond quickly.
Yeah.
Very similar to what Eric said when he was responding to Richard, that we're always looking for new partners in the partnership to help us be able to disseminate this information more widely. And like you said, having student projects be disseminated or student written works. In one of Eric's classes that he teaches, he has them do a data story using interesting data points or also a policy brief to sort of promote the use of these metrics to a certain group around the world. And some of these we have published on our website, on our blog, that we also share in our newsletter, which I'm happy to also, if any of you are interested in receiving that, to reach out to Andrew, and then I can put you on our distribution list. But these things, we have them available, but I agree we need to sort of work with others to to disseminate them more widely and more with the general public and different community groups as well.
Can I make a comment on that? Andrew, he has a weekly video that go on YouTube. If you came up with a group like this that had a particular project and continued on to like fuzz the data, how to do it, maybe we could have one of those Zoom meetings dedicated to 4 of your students who would present their findings and, you know, something like that. And then we can give you more visibility because we've got a YouTube channel with, what is it, 260 views so far. So that might be enough for us.
I was thinking the same thing, Madeline, that your slides showing all your partners, Perry, were all circular logos. And I thought we have a circular logo. Yeah, look into that. Yeah, because I think one of the things about CACOR is that our diversity kind of matches the diversity of the data that you're dealing with. So we do have a lot of reach into different areas, different aspects, as somebody said, from anthropology to zoology. Richard, you have your hand up again. You have another. There you go.
Okay, so I just wanted to let you know, Sean Menard, who is the counselor, the city councillor, who is in charge of the climate change committee in Ottawa. And I would highly recommend you reach out to him. Just a couple of weeks ago, I along with others, presented to the climate change committee, but they do have a committee of councillors who are specifically tasked with dealing with climate change and so forth in the city of Ottawa. And if you were to present your data to him and, you know, illustrate just how badly we are off in Ottawa and how much there's a real need for change in Ottawa, and to sort of push things along further, because it's not just about politics, it's about economics, it's about health. And he's got that, I think he got that message when I spoke. But it's one way of, it's one avenue. And the other thing is to send your data to the MPP, for Ottawa, Colorado, or whoever your local MPP is. And you get them to bring it to the provincial government as well. So it's not just feds, it's provincial, it's municipal, it's at all levels. And that's one of the things we pointed out in the article yesterday, which you will get a copy of in the next item.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, unless there are any other last minute questions, it's kind of my job to thank once again Eiffel and all of the presenters for some really powerful, thought-provoking stuff. We are going to get this on both your YouTube and ours to get some reach out there. I'm just going to throw up that slide where we started and remind everyone, you gave a great introduction there. The Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, or CACOR, is dedicated to intelligent debate and action on global issues. We do have a vast library, as Madeline mentioned, of articles and videos featuring some of the best writers in Canada, if not on the planet, talking about challenges that affect us all. And I strongly encourage everyone to check out our website at